I had the pleasure to listen to most of the pitches tonight, and I'm happy to say that the quality of early stage startup is going up in our region. So, a few words about myself. My name is Rumen Iliev. I'm partner at LAUNCHub Ventures, an early stage venture firm investing in the whole Southeast Europe. And this is it about myself. I'm honored to have here at this Fireside session Bogomil Balkansky, partner at one of the oldest and the most prestigious venture firms in the world, Sequoia Capital. Is their memo that the startup sent to the startup founders 2 months ago that called the coronavirus the black swan of 2020. I have the privilege to know Bogomil for more than 8 years now. It was back in 2012 when I met him for the first time. And Bogomil, maybe you don't remember, but you did back then a very insightful B2B sales workshop with the LAUNCHub Ventures portfolio company.
I do remember.
So this is how actually my partner Rumen introduced us, and this was the first time I met Bogomil, but he has been a great supporter for the community. He has put up an amazing curriculum with the Bulgarian Innovation Hub currently in the Silicon Valley for the new batch. And at the time actually I met Bogomil in 2012, he was managing the cloud division of VMware. I think at that point, if I'm not mistaken, the cloud division brought about 80% of the VMware revenue. So obviously, I had very high opinion of him. And then at one moment, he just left VMware and joined the startup. And I'll give the floor to Bogomil to introduce himself and tell you his story. Bogomil, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Rumen. Very quickly, I grew up in Bulgaria. Left the country immediately after high school and went to the US to get an education, and ended up sticking around and making a life for myself. Have lived in the Bay Area for 22 years now, and I have been in tech for 20 years, I guess. I got into the tech industry right out of business school, and the way that happened was I happened to go to Stanford during the very crest of the dot-com wave. That was 98 through 2000. And like many young people at the time, I did get the technology bug and, got a job at a technology startup. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't choose very well. And the startup that I picked ended up falling apart during the tech recession of 2001. But anyways, I had already chosen my path. And lo and behold, 20 years later, I'm still in technology. My wheelhouse is product management and product marketing. Always led teams in enterprise software companies, kind of up and down the technology stack, from deep data center infrastructure, which was VMware, to CRM apps, which was Siebel, to platform as a service, which was Bebop, to HR and recruiting related solution, which was Bebop and Google. After I left Google in 2018, I took a nice long sabbatical, spent 18 months just indulging my personal passions, and joined Sequoia 5 months ago, beginning of January. At Sequoia, I focus on enterprise technologies very broadly. Sequoia is a firm has a huge bias that all of us are generalists. In other words, like we don't specialize very narrowly. There's nothing like I'm the security specialist or I'm the SaaS specialist at Sequoia. And the rationale for this is that markets come and go, and we need to stay current. So all of us need to keep open mind and move on as markets move. Glad to be with you this evening. I haven't had a chance to listen to many pitches. I've just listened to the last one, but it has been gratifying to me to see the startup ecosystem in Southeast Europe develop and mature. My first foray into investing in the ecosystem in Bulgaria was Netinfo, the company that my friend Rumen Belov founded all the way back in '99. And I had invested like the princely sum of $5,000 out of my student budget. Call it beginner's luck, whatever you want to call it. It was a 7x return on my initial $5,000 investment. And again, who knew that 20 years later, I'll start doing that professionally. So that was an auspicious sign and an auspicious event, the start of my career in investing. So happy to answer any questions that might be on your mind.
Bogomil, I have prepared a few, and maybe we can also have some questions from the audience if the organizers help us at the end by reading them at Crowdcast. One of my first question is that, all right, so we survived, obviously, the first wave. So it's visible already that the bar for raising venture capital has gone up. But this is what we see from our part of the world. What is your view on the fundraising in Silicon Valley? What's your view and development that you expect in the following months?
Yeah, the funding environment continues to be very, very active. And to be honest, I think we haven't really seen any dramatic changes in the funding environment. We haven't seen major decrease in activity. We haven't seen valuations like come down in any significant way. And this may be simply a result of the fact that the public stock markets are holding up surprisingly well. And I think it's fair to say that there's a big disconnect between what the real economy is doing versus what Wall Street is doing. It's pretty obvious that we are in what is the deepest worldwide recession, probably ever recorded. The unemployment stands at like more than 30 million people, like in the U.S., which hasn't happened since the Great Depression of the 1930s of like last century. And so on one hand, the real economy is hurting. On the other hand, the public markets are surprisingly and unexpectedly and inexplicably robust. And I think the venture funding environment takes a lot of cues, quite honestly, from the state of the public markets. And because the public markets are holding up, the venture funding environment continues to be fairly robust. What we experienced was that once the lockdown in the US started in March, a lot of companies rushed to try to raise money. Everybody did some very quick triaging and strategic planning, and the first thought on the minds of a lot of startups was, how can we extend runway? Totally reasonable. And there were two ways to do it. You either try to decrease your burn rate or you try to raise more money. And I think every single company basically worked on this dual track. How do I bolster my balance sheet with more capital? How do I cut costs to prepare for what might be a long recession? And in March, we saw 2x increase in the amount of activity and the number of meetings that we normally have. It subsided a little bit in April and has kind of returned to normal, since then. But I would say the funding environment is still fairly robust.
All right. Basically, every crisis creates opportunities. Every recession creates opportunities. I'm certain that in Sequoia, you have thought deeply on some of the verticals where these opportunities can be created. We will share with us your view on some domains and vertical you consider interesting in such times of downturn.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that once the world starts going back to normal, it's going to be a new normal. We're not going to go back to exactly the same place where we were in January and February of this year. And, it's anybody's guess what the new normal is going to be. But we certainly have developed, some hypotheses around what might be some interesting opportunities. Some of the obvious ones, have to do with enablement of more work from home. A lot of technology companies in particular have been making announcements that they're not going to reopen their offices until January of next year. Some companies like Coinbase, for example, announced that they're simply not going back to an office environment. They will remain a completely work from home company, which basically means that it will be an opportunity for there'll be all sorts of opportunities like to enable better work from home. It starts from the very bottom of the stack, right? It may be surprising to you, but there's still areas in the US that, broadband coverage is kind of lacking. And, if you're living in a rural area in the US, that's actually an opportunity as a requirement, for new infrastructure investment, even at the bandwidth level, slightly higher up in the stack. I think there will be a need for a new solution to enable secure work from home. Solutions like VPNs, virtual private networks, like VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, I think will get a new lease on life. These have been very traditional, boring, stagnant markets, but we believe that all of a sudden they'll become new and sexy, and we expect to see some innovation kind of at that level of the stack. the general theme being enablement of work from home. And then, at the highest level of the stack, I think we'll see more innovation in different sorts of collaboration and productivity tools that are specifically tuned to the work from home scenario. Zoom has been the biggest beneficiary of this crisis, and for them it has been a huge opportunity. And we've been very lucky and privileged, to be investors in Zoom. But I think there's still a lot of unsolved challenges around working from home. So, for example, how do you do brainstorming? What is the equivalent of a whiteboard session? There are many things about the office work environment that currently are difficult to recreate, like when you're working from home. And when it comes to work from home or kind of fully distributed workforce, there will also be a lot more mundane problems to be solved. If you think about what does it mean for a company to be geographically distributed across multiple countries? How do you do payroll in multiple countries? How do you do health benefits in multiple countries, etc.? So there's a whole range of, again, what I call mundane problems, but they're actually very significant real-life problems. So one big theme is work from home, but that actually kind of percolates up and down, the entire technology stack from the very base level infrastructure to people collaboration and communication. There are other interesting trends around telehealth, telemedicine. The crisis basically has exposed vulnerabilities in the healthcare systems of all advanced countries. On one hand, we don't have enough capacity. On the other hand, I think the health systems are being clogged with a lot of unnecessary hospital visits, etc. And now that COVID has forced everybody to be at home, that has really given a major impetus to telehealth and telemedicine. We see a huge trend around performing various aspects of our social lives from home. And what I mean by that is, exercise from home, or socialize, from home. Think about a lot of our social life so far have been around going to a real destination. You go to the gym to exercise, you go to the bar to socialize, you go to the restaurant, to eat together. And if some of these things are completely not possible, or at least will remain somewhat dangerous in the foreseeable future until we have a vaccine for COVID, what is the replacement, for these things? And I think some of us have already suffered through a fair number of these very awkward, Zoom happy hours and social hours. And I'm personally completely zoomed out at this point. And quite honestly, the last thing I want is to socialize.
To have a cup of beer or a wine over Zoom.
Exactly. So there is a need for something that's different from Zoom that will allow us to have that human connection. So these are just some of the trends that have been on our mind.
That's very insightful, and I did a very unrepresentative survey asking basically our teams from our portfolio, do they feel more productive? Are they more productive or less productive? And I actually was surprised to figure out that most of the developers agree that they're much more productive than before. Most of the founders agree that the company is moving faster in terms of product development currently. Only the people with kids complain. But everybody else actually explained that they have developed so many product features, and their productivity is skyrocketing at this point. They're managing their teams late at night. So it's I think that there are things here to stay after the COVID, and as you mentioned, working from home and all of the aspects of this. It's interesting, very interesting topic. Now, when you said about managing a company in different countries, one of the news recently announced is that Sequoia Capital is coming to Europe. That is what we know from the news. So can you share what are the next steps in this, and also what are the stages or the round sizes that Sequoia is going to do in Europe, or anything that will be relevant here?
So we made an announcement that we have hired Luciana Alexandru, who hails from Romania. a proud daughter of Romania. So, we're just bolstering the ranks of Eastern Europeans at Sequoia. And she used to work at Excel, for quite a few years. She will be officially starting at Sequoia in September. So she's not officially on board, and she's not really working until September. But we'll be building a full-scale operation. And Luciana is not going to be alone in that office in the UK. We will build fully fledged capability in Europe, and we'll build all the company building functions that we have around recruiting and talent, marketing, etc. That's not going to happen overnight, but certainly build all these capabilities. The model that we'll follow in Europe is going to be exactly the same one that we have in the US for one simple reason. We're actually not raising separate funds to invest in Europe, and our investments in Europe will happen from the US-based funds. Or in other words, we'll have a single family of funds from which we do investments in North America and in Europe. The rationale for this is that it is really a single economy in many ways between the US and Europe. In other words, companies that grow out of Europe sooner or later come to the US market. At some point, they actually may generate majority of their revenue from the North American market, and vice versa. Companies that grow out of the US at some point invariably step on the European market. And so from that perspective, we really view the European and the North American markets as so tightly interconnected that it doesn't make sense for us to try to separate them. So Luciana is the beginning of our presence in Europe, but she will be really a member of a single integrated team that spans the Atlantic. In terms of stages, again, we're not going to reinvent some new playbook. Sequoia partners with companies from ideation or incubation all the way to IPO. And we will be participating across all of these stages in Europe
as well. Okay, interesting. I know you have been asked many times this question, and I do have to ask it, since most of the people who watch us are startup founders. So if I don't, they'll kill me. You know what's coming, right? So
let's make sure that they don't kill you.
Yeah. Yes, I'm hiding, as you can see, in a house outside of Sofia. So I guess they won't physically be able to get to me. What are you looking for when you're deciding on investing in a startup? What are the KPIs? What are the criteria? How can they get to you and convince you to invest?
Yeah, I guess your question is mostly about early stage startups, because listen, the criteria obviously are dramatically different depending on stage of a company. The way you evaluate a seed stage company is very different from the way you evaluate a Series C company, right? At seed stage, Series A, there's precious few metrics, right? There are no really meaningful metrics in terms of revenue, etc. So you really try to evaluate two things. You try to evaluate the potential size of the market, and you try to evaluate the quality of the team. And I know this is a very trite answer, but pretty much every VC, will give you. But the algorithm of how we go about our investment decisions isn't more. It is very complicated because these are tough decisions, because we need to make them in the absence of a lot of data. We need to make them in the presence of a lot of ambiguity. So they're tough decisions, but the things that, we try to develop conviction around aren't many. It really comes down to two things. Can we imagine that there will be large enough markets, for whatever the startup is building, and is that the right team to capture the opportunity? When we talk about market size, I do emphasize imagine, because very often, the market is unclear. Very often companies that emerge as market leaders are doing something new and disruptive, and there isn't an established market for it. So it's, you can take a Gartner report and say the market for X is $10 billion. And by the way, don't send VCs Gartner reports that say that your market is $10 billion, because if somebody's making $10 billion, from somewhere, it doesn't entitle you to a single cent of it. And vice versa. You may be onto something new and totally different that didn't exist before, and there is no market size for it currently, but it could become a $10 billion market. And so really the complexity of our selection algorithm is to figure out can there be a large market for this thing 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road?